Father, we thank you for your word. We thank you that what you have given us is clear and for salvation. And Father, the means by which you intend to grow us through this powerful word that you've been using to create and to sanctify from the beginning. Father, as we dive into these things, help us to love you more as a result and to shine more brightly to the places you've assigned to us. It's in Jesus' name, amen. Okay, so we're back in our series in Exodus. I think we'll finish Exodus tonight. We've been in Exodus now for several weeks. I don't know, a couple of months probably, but we're gonna jump through the last chapters pretty quickly for good reason. But we're gonna finish the Ten Commandments where we got halfway done with last time, and then we'll see how far we get. But by way of reminder, we've talked about how the Ten Commandments weren't laws in themselves because they weren't specific in any sense. But they were sort of the faceplate of the 613 laws, that the moral grounding for the rest of the laws. All the other laws find their grounding in one of the 10 of the Ten Commandments in some real moral sense. And so we've looked at that, and we talked about, we asked kind of why God had these commands for us in each of these commands. The first one being, no other gods before me. And we talked about how we are, by nature, worshipful creatures, are going to worship something, and that that our hearts are often idol factories, producing idolatry, producing things in front of God, and that the struggle of the Christian life in large part is indeed obeying the first command of not having other things in front of God. Talked about no images of God, which is tied to the first one in a lot of ways. And then the third one we talked about we spent some time on was don't take the name of the Lord your God in vain, which we said is not primarily about speaking the name of God, like we've thought about it for some reason in the modern world. The word take there is translated almost every time in the Old Testament. It's translated as the word carry, and that's really what's in view here. It's the same thing as what we mean by take in English. It means to carry God's name in vain, so without intention of being God's. So it is probably at least in part about speaking God's name flippantly, but as a result of carrying God's name in vain. So there are lots of people, we're in the Southeast America, we're in the Bible Belt, there are lots of people who break this command, who carry the Lord's name, but have no intention of being the Lord's. And that's what this command is really about. We talked about maybe the chief example historically of that is the Crusades, where men were literally carrying the name of Christ and the symbol of Christ in a flag form and doing immense evil and atrocities in that name. And you can imagine them coming into a city saying, we come in the name of the Lord, and God in heaven saying, no, they do not. And that's the idea of carrying God's name without the intention of living in the way that He calls. We talked about the Sabbath and how it's not sort of an outlier, that God still intends in some sense, at least principally, for us to have a restful day, a day that is set apart and different in some sense than the other days. There's no reason to pull this one apart and make it totally unrelated to us on this side of Christ. That there is still a principle, the Lord's Day, the church called it, as opposed to the Sabbath, moving from Saturday to Sunday, because that's the day the Lord rose, was the day that they operated in that week. But they still saw that week as a day that is different, in the same way the Jews saw the Sabbath as different. The Christians saw Sundays as different. And then finally, we talked about the command to honor thy father, thy mother, and that being a command that is obviously the foundation of all society. So it's a good command for all kinds of reasons, but it's clear that the honoring of father and mother is the foundation of a family, which is the foundation of society, and all things come back to this idea. And even more largely, that the idea of honoring father and mother is a call to honor those who have come before you and who know more than you, that there's a lot of audacity for a 12-year-old that thinks they shouldn't honor their father and mother, the one who literally brought them into the world and who have been on earth much longer than them. Right? There's a sort of pride and arrogance that comes with not honoring father and mother. And so it's not just a call to that temporal honoring of father and mother while you're a child or even as an adult, but it's a call to honoring the things that have come before you and assuming that those who have lived before you have something to teach you. There's a connection there, I think. And we talked about how that word honor is, it literally means to give weight to make heavy. So it is to make your parents heavy. And that word is only ever used about two entities in the Bible. It's used about your parents and it's used about God. We are called to give weight to our parents, and we are called to give weight to God, to see them in a weighty way and treat them as such. Okay, we have made it to the second half of the Ten Commandments, which begins with, thou shalt not murder. Thou shalt not murder. Why? Why? Thoughts on why God gave this command, perhaps the easiest of them, but just thoughts in general. Why was it important enough for God to say, thou shalt not murder? Why is that bad for society? Why is it bad for the world? Why is it bad for you? Well, you might get murdered if it wasn't bad, right? And there's people getting killed. But being alive seems like a central aspect of living well. And so if God wants us to live well, then being alive is an important part of that. Obviously, generally the second half of the commands have been kind of oriented towards, thought of as love your neighbor, as the first five are thought of as love your God, which is interesting with the honor father and mother being up there. But obviously you're loving your neighbor well by not murdering your neighbor. It is important that you know that it's, before that, look at Genesis chapter 9. Genesis 9, verse 6. Right? It was wrong for Cain to kill Abel, even though God hadn't given us 10 commandments yet. Right? That's an important thing. These moral truths didn't become moral truths when God spoke the 10 commandments or wrote them on the stone tablets. Cain was guilty of murder before the words were penned. There's an eternal truth that's being pointed to with each of these, which is a big deal. There's something transcendent. It's not just that God makes arbitrary laws and says from now on you got to follow them. These laws were laws forever. These laws are part of God's nature. It is part of God's nature that it's wrong to murder. It's part of God's nature that it's right to honor father and mother. Right? It's part of God himself, all these moral truths grounded in God. Genesis 9, verse 6. Whoever sheds the blood of man, by man shall his blood be shed, for God made man in his own image. Okay, it gives you the reason. For God made man in his own image. It's not wrong for you. You can't you can't murder a chicken. Well, maybe you could. That's a discussion. But in general, when you eat chicken, it's not the result of murder. That chicken was killed, but it was not murdered. Right? Murder it holds moral connotations, and it can only be done in the truest sense to humans who carry the image of God. And in fact, the death penalty is given to those who murder humans because humans are made in the image of God. There was penalty for harming animals as well, but nothing nearly as harsh because of the difference. Also, look back at Exodus 20 and 21. It's important, if your Bible says thou shalt not kill, that's not right. That's not a correct translation. There's different words in Hebrew for murder and for kill. Again, murder carries that moral connotation. And the idea of murder is it's unlawful killing. Killing isn't in itself unlawful. For instance, look at chapter 21, verse 12. So this is literally the next chapter. A re-quoting of Genesis 9. Whoever strikes a man so that he dies shall be killed or shall be put to death. Right? So there is lawful killing. Certainly in Israel, where God was the king, there was capital punishment. It was carried out very rarely, by the way. From everything we can read in Jewish sources, it was almost never carried out, which is an interesting discussion. But it was part of the law that if you at least outside of murder, but if you murdered someone, you were to be killed. Right? There's two different verbs there because it's two different things. There's people dying in both entities. That's just Claudia banging her head against the door. Literally, nose or head, unfortunately, not her knuckles. But here we have the same idea, or we have someone losing their life in both cases. One is wrong and one is not wrong. And so the idea of thou shalt not murder is indeed that. It's an unlawful killing. So that obviously it doesn't necessarily mean that war is sinful. That's a different kind of discussion. But killing in war as a soldier is not sinful because it's murder. It's not murder, but it may be sinful for other reasons, which we could talk about. Okay, thoughts on that one before we move on to the next one? Thoughts on murder. Anybody pro-murder? Okay. The next one is thou shalt not commit adultery. Thou shalt not commit adultery. Now, why? Why is that important to God? Why do you think that's such a big deal that it's part of these moral foundations? You shall not commit adultery. Thoughts? Yeah, because you're harming the image of God. Yeah, there's certainly a love your neighbor, that you're not loving them well when you are committing adultery. So there's a covenant aspect, which we'll come to again in a minute. Actually, there's certainly a covenant aspect, and the way that it's often described when Israel disobeyed is that they're breaking the covenant. Right? They're breaking the covenant with God. There's sort of this marriage language very often between God and Israel, and when Israel disobeys, they are breaking their vows. Really, literally, they're breaking their marital vows to God. Yes, there's covenant language for sure. Just more simply, I think we see here that God values the family as an entity, and adultery very often breaks the family. At the very least, it greatly harms the family. And so we have this assumption, it seems, at least in Ten Commandments, this assumption that families are important and are a big deal. And so we are not to commit adultery. So thinking about Deuteronomy 10, that these commandments are for your good. But obviously there's moral dimensions. But to take it apart from just morality, adultery is bad for society. If you don't believe me, look at society. I mean, compare the world now versus the world even just 100 years ago, where obviously that world had its problems, but the amount of marriages that stayed together 100 years ago is infinite compared to the ones that are staying together now. And the result of that is obvious, that it's going to make things with children more difficult. We know it's a fact. It's not always the case, but it's a fact that children tend to do better in homes that are not divorced. That's just sociological fact. We know that. Cultures tend to do better when families stay together. And so this command obviously is aimed at our good, that in general, adultery is going to cause pain to families, and so God is trying to help us to avoid that pain. Of course, we are sinners, and of course, things happen, and of course, obviously, divorce happens, and all those things. And we're living in an imperfect world, and we're dealing with imperfect realities constantly. But this command also aimed at our good, knowing that the family is an important thing. All right, the next one is thou shalt not steal, which is interesting. Thou shalt not steal. And here's why it's interesting. Well, it's interesting for a lot of reasons, but one of the reasons is there's the assumption of property. That there's the assumption that people can own things, right? So it's anti-communist in that sense. There's a validation of the reality that that you can own something and in some real sense it be yours, and therefore to take it from that person is wrong, right? So stealing is wrong, obviously, because you're not loving your neighbor well. But in that command, we see that God is pro-property. That's a weird way to say it, but you understand what I'm saying. That it is not incorrect or unbiblical for people to own things. Property is assumed, and taking that property that is not yours is sinful. Okay, thoughts on any of those things? Yeah, you end up with why are we stealing, right? That's good. And that's there's one more, but I'll just add this one at the bottom. The Jewish people, interestingly, see the last command, which is thou shalt not covet. They'll describe that often as the ground of the previous four. That covetousness is in some real sense the ground of murder, the ground of adultery, the ground of stealing, and the ground of lying, which is the next one. I think there's a lot of truth to that. That you do those things largely because you covet, whatever that thing is, you covet. Thoughts on that? The fourth or ninth one there being thou shalt not lie. Thou shalt not lie. Now, thoughts on that one? Why is that important? Maybe imagine for a second, just imagine for a second that you had children and you weren't a Christian, okay, and you wanted to explain to them why they shouldn't lie. What would you say? If you weren't a Christian, you didn't believe in real kind of ultimate, objective, transcendent right and wrong, but you wanted to explain to them that they shouldn't lie, what would you say? Honest question. Why should they not lie? Yeah, what do you mean? Why is trust important? Yeah, that'd be some sort of trust to have any sort of relationship. Yeah. I think a large part of raising teenagers is convincing them how important it is that you are trustworthy. Like how much better your life is if you can be trusted. And that's in all sense, right? If I have a teenager who I can trust, their life is much more enjoyable for them than if I can't trust them, right? That's just right? That's not even just Christian, right? We're just talking about the reasonability of the reasonableness of not being a lying person. It's almost like God knew that it was going to be bad for us if we got in the habit of lying, right? It's not just that it's wrong sort of ontologically, which it is, right? It's wrong because it's against God. But it's also wrong because it's bad for you in a real sense, right? It's not just bad for you to murder, it's bad for you to lie. And your life will be harder if you're a lying person. That's objectively true. Your life will be harder. Now, you may skip some hurdles, but you end up in your own particular kind of Hades when you do that. So obviously the same. So if you're a teenager who cannot be trusted, your life is harder. You don't get the freedom. Your curfew's earlier. If you even get to leave the house, you get less fun things. That doesn't stop when you're not a teenager anymore. When you become an adult and you have an employer, you're given much more freedom if they trust that you're going to get the job done. You're going to work hard. You're going to put in your time. You're going to be faithful. You're going to be loyal. You get much more freedom. You get much more. It's true. It's certainly true in your marriages. It's true in everything. If you are able to be trusted, someone believes you when you speak, things go better for you. If you can't be believed, everything's going to be hard. Every relationship's going to be hard, certainly. Yeah, Pop.
It has consequences.
Yeah, so much of our society is based on believing that you're telling the truth, right? The whole judicial system is based on you telling the truth, and you can get thrown in jail just for not telling the truth, right? It's no little thing to lie. It is weighty, and yeah, all of society is in some sense based on you got to trust somebody. I mean, you don't know everything, you're going to trust somebody. You don't know how to get everything done, you're going to trust somebody. You're going to have to trust people throughout your life, and if lying is a part of the world, then there can almost be no real world, no society. Other thoughts? Yeah. Yeah, that's so good. The other day on Monday, of course, because Valentine's was today. Monday, I decided that I was going to get Ariel something, and so I was making a journey to Birmingham. And now in modern world, like I can't go anywhere without everyone knowing because of my location being all these things, and so like Ariel called and asked me what I was doing, and I lied, and then Caleb called, and I was like, well, he's going to talk to Kayla, and she talks to Ariel. I guess I lied to Caleb, and I had to fess it all up today. Caleb came in my office, and I told him I went to the hospital on a hospital visit because that's why I'm in Birmingham most of the time. And he said, "How was the hospital?" I said, "I lied to you, man. It was all fake. None of it was true." But I mean, just like a little thing. And now I'm in 3 lies as opposed to 1 truth. Anyway, but the point I want to see here, which I think is profound, and I think is a sign of maturity when you realize this, is that God is not just arbitrarily making commands to kill our fun. He's saying this is going to be best for you in some real sense. These commands are good for you, not just for the good for the world, but good for you. Sanctifying, of course, making you more like Christ, of course, but also the way that God intended for you to live. Right? We talked about that's so good. We talked about how the Exodus wasn't over when they got free from the Red Sea. Right? When they crossed the Red Sea and they're out of Egypt. They're out of tyranny. They're out of slavery. But they're not, that's not it yet. Right? They're still not ultimate. Right? If there was no Mount Sinai, they never would have reached paradise. Because freedom in the ultimate sort of sense of do whatever you want, whenever you want, however you want, which was then before Sinai, is not good for anything or anyone. But what they had come to is what philosophers will call ordered freedom, right? That they're free inside of the bounds of what is good, and that was what was able to lead them to paradise. And we know that to be true now. That we see God saying, yes, you are free from sin, you are saved, right? You are no longer in Egypt. That doesn't mean your life is over. This is how I intended for human life to look like. This is what I intended for you to be, and this is the pathway to your joy. It shouldn't be shocking that when God says do this, that thing is the pathway to your joy and away from your misery. Even if it's temporarily pain, it's ultimate joy, and probably much sooner than ultimate. Okay, and then thou shalt not covet. This one is not as obvious as others. Like I don't remember who it was I was reading, but he said that the other commands he probably could have figured out, maybe outside of this one and the Sabbath. He could have figured out the other commands just sort of by moral reasoning, right, by the moral law God's given us. But he doesn't know if he would have come to the conclusion that thou shalt not covet is a wrong thing. Right, that's a little different. Right, first of all, it's not a physical thing. Right, coveting is inside. It's a mental thing. It's a heart thing. It's about what I want. It's about wanting something that isn't mine. It's about a desire. Right, these are all physical actions. Obviously, Christ makes them more than that. Right, of course. But these are all physical actions, and this one is a heart thing. So we do see that God is concerned about the heart. And again, this one in many ways is the ground of the rest of them. And 21st century America is built upon the foundational idea that you're going to covet. I mean, the consumeristic culture we live in is successful because we are a covetous people. Because we spend so much of our lives, especially with the constant ads that we're being faced with, thinking, man, if I only had that, if I could just do that, I mean, if I could just live like that, if I had that product or that person or that thing or that life or whatever it is, consumerism is banking on us disobeying this command, right? It's a very natural thing, not meaning that in the good sense. It's a natural thing to covet what is not yours, and there's right. I mean, there's some sort of line we can draw, right? If a young Christian in our church sees Chance and Jordan with their children, and they say, "Wow, that looks like a great life that they have. They're in a good marriage. They have kids that are joyful." They can covet that marriage, right? They can want a marriage like that, but that's different than coveting Chance's husband or coveting Jordan's wife. There's a particularness that makes it sinful. You know what I mean? Well, maybe you know what I mean. Chance's wife or Jordan's husband. So it's not wrong to have good and holy ambitions, right? It's not wrong. It is a good thing for a young man to say, I want a marriage like that. I want a family like that. I want a job like that. Those are good things in general. But when it comes to particular coveting, you're kind of taking the cheap way and saying, I just want that one. I don't want one like that. I want that one. And it becomes sinful. And often that is, again, the ground of all the other things. Okay, thoughts on that? Thoughts on those? Yeah, that's great. That's great. There's a we'll see this again, but there's a lot of emphasis, and sometimes it's obvious, sometimes it's less obvious, about not being Egypt and not being Canaan. We'll see it with the golden calf pretty clearly in a minute, but that you are to not be like what you are coming from, and you are not to be like what you're coming to. You are meant to be different. You're meant to be holy in the literal sense. You're meant to be set apart, different in those things. And like Mark is pointing out, that these people have been in Egypt their whole lives.
You're not doing that.
Yeah, well, we know that. So, yeah, there is some distinction to make. Like, for instance, Rahab is praised for lying when she hides Christians or Jews in her attic when she's in Jericho. And she's praised in the Old Testament, and she's praised in the New Testament for it. And so, yeah, I think there's an interesting discussion to be had there about what exactly is the sinful part of deception. And it seems, I mean, the kind of off-the-cuff answer is the motivation for it plays a big part. That Rahab was lying for the good of the people of God and even God's advancement Himself, and so in that sense was not. So it's not as simple as it's a blanket thing, which I think maybe gives us some leeway when someone asks us if they look fat or something, So yeah, that's a great point. That it's not there's not a simple one-to-one always and every like there is for murder, but Revelation. Yeah, liars go to hell, burn, burn, burn. Yeah, y'all didn't sing that one at bedtime. No, we didn't either. Yeah, that's good, Kevin. Good point. What else? What do you say? Yeah, you lead that one Sunday. Put that on the list. We have, Christian or not, it's across the board agreed that what we have in Exodus and Leviticus and Numbers and Deuteronomy in the law is certainly the far and away most sophisticated law of the time period without being close. I mean, we have serious laws against men for harming women, which was entirely novel. Laws about how you treat your slaves, which was entirely novel. How you treat the foreigner, how you treat the widow, how you treat the orphan. I mean, the widow and the orphan being cared for is entirely Christian, before entirely Judeo-Christian. But outside of our worldview, the widow and the orphan were just cast aside, which is what you would expect. And then from the very beginning, from the laws in Exodus, the people of God are told to care for the widow, and to care for the orphan, and care for the outcast, and care for the foreigner who's not of your people, and treat him as your own. And these radical moral laws for these slaves, really impressive things. One that I like, I find funny, Exodus 23, verse 4. So the rest of the book is essentially the laws and then the tabernacle and those things. But Exodus 23, verse 4 says, if you meet your enemy's ox or his donkey going astray, you shall bring it back to him, which is like, hey, finders keepers, not a thing, not a thing. It's not yours, bring it back. I like just stuff like that. Like it's more mature laws than we have in Hammurabi's Code or other Mesopotamian literature at the time, and anything really until much more modern laws that are far beyond their times. That's not even a good enough way to say it. The laws treat memorial as important, right? So there's lots of memorials they have to remember certain things. There's also lots of ritual that is taken great care of. Two things, by the way, I think we've put asunder to our harm in the modern world of losing the beauty and meaning of ritual, and even of memorial in some sense. But that was very important in this law. And then we talked about a lot of the laws being don't do that like Egypt did it, and don't do that like Canaan does it. And then we see this sort of covenant ratification in Exodus 24, verse 5 and following. Exodus 24, verse 5. Verse 4. Verse 3. Moses came and told all the people the words of the Lord and all the rules. And all the people answered with one voice and said, all the words the Lord has spoken we will do. And Moses wrote down all the words of the Lord. He rose early in the morning and built an altar at the foot of the mountain, 12 pillars according to the 12 tribes of Israel. And he sent young men of the people of Israel who offered burnt offerings, sacrificed peace offerings of oxen to the Lord. And Moses took half of the blood and put it in basins, and half of the blood he threw against the altar. Then he took the book of the covenant and read it in the hearing of the people. And they said, all the Lord has spoken we will do. We will be obedient. And Moses took the blood and threw it on the people and said, behold, the blood of the covenant that the Lord has made with you in accordance with all these words. Okay, so we have this covenant laid out, this covenant ratified. The people say we will do it. It is very parallel to a marriage ceremony, right? It's the I do's. They're given the I do's. We will do it. People says we have heard and we will do it. And of course we have the blood as a part of all of these things. The blood first on the altar, which is foreshadowing the cross, and then the blood on the people, which is foreshadowing what happens as a result of the cross. And even the realization and foreshadowing already that the blood will be that which cleanses us and not our obedience. We will obey, but as a result of the obedience and not, or a result of the blood, not for the blood. Also, it's an important thing we think about covenants. We think about them like the only. We take vows in various forms of lines of work, normally government type of work, but the main vow we think of vow as a marriage vow, right? In the modern world, we still take marriage vows, which is just it's a covenant word. We have a marriage covenant. You are when you get married, you are covenanting with your partner. What does that mean, right? When Israel said these things we will do, did they think they were going to do them all perfectly? I think you'd be hard-pressed to say that they did. Right? They didn't mean we're going to do this all perfectly, but they did mean we're going to do this. Right? We're going to do this truly. We're going to follow you. And in parallel, when a husband and a wife stand before their family and friends, and to use the traditional vows, say, I promise to have and to hold from this day forward, for better or for worse, for richer for poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, till death do we part. Are they thinking I'm going to love and cherish them perfectly every moment? Of course not. Right? To be faithful to a covenant doesn't necessarily mean being perfect to the covenant. It just means being faithful, right? One can be faithful without perfection. A faithful husband is not a perfect husband. And so this covenant idea is important for us, in that Israel does break the covenant. Right? But the breaking of the covenant is not primarily in their disobedience to individual laws. That was expected. The breaking of the covenant is that they turn to other gods. Right? To use the marital, the clear breaking of a covenant in a marriage is adultery. That's what adultery means. It means to break a covenant. Right? So the clear breaking of the marriage covenant, the clearest way to break that covenant is adultery, which is a physical sign of the spiritual transcendent intimacy between the man and the woman. Israel does that, right? They turn to other gods repeatedly. If you think about David, the king of Israel, who has said, a man after God's own heart, and you think, how could that be after all the things David did? David made some terrible mistakes. But the thing that's said about David over and over and over is that he never turned to other gods. He never turned, he stayed with God. He stayed with God. He stayed with God. And so because of that, he's called a man after God's own heart. And so we have this covenantal language, which is to be in covenant with God, which all of us are, is not to say I am going to be perfect. It's just to say I'm going to stay with you. I'm going to stay with you. I will be yours as you are mine. Make mistake after mistake after mistake, of course, but those mistakes aren't the same as breaking the covenant. That's a different thing. Okay. Thoughts on that? Anyone? Thoughts on that? All right, last thing is the tabernacle. So the rest of the book, largely, and we'll do chapter 32 next week, but that'll be all we do in Exodus. But the rest of the book is largely about the tabernacle. So God tells them how to build the tabernacle, and then they build the tabernacle, which is the rest of the book, basically after 32, which is the golden calf chapter, which we'll look at next week. But if you've read these chapters before, then you know how kind of tedious, right? How tedious they are to get through, and you read them and think, what in the world? Who cares? Right? Who cares what the corner of the temple in that side looks like? Who cares? But like all of those things are on purpose. Right? There's nothing superfluous. All of them are meaningful. Look at chapter 26, verse 33. I think it'd be a good practice exercise to go back and read these chapters and think about the Garden of Eden as you do it, because so much of what's being said here is tying us back to Eden. Right? The tabernacle is in some sense the new Eden, the temple being the new Eden, and then us being the new tabernacle, the new temple being the new Eden, the place where God meets man. There's a lot of connections there. Look at chapter 26, verse 33. And you shall hang the veil from the clasps and bring the ark of the testimony, ark of the covenant, in there within the veil. And the veil shall separate for you the holy place from the most holy. You shall put the mercy seat on the ark of the testimony in the most holy place. And you shall set the table outside the veil and the lampstand on the south side of the tabernacle opposite the table. You shall put the table on the north side, etc., etc. So we have this veil being erected. Verse 36, you shall make a screen for the entrance of the tent of blue and purple and scarlet yarns. Very interesting. And fine twined linen embroidered with needlework. So we have this veil being established, the same veil, of course, that would be torn when Christ died on the cross, right? This thing that separates the most holy place where God himself is said to be from the rest of everything, the thing that would be torn down by Christ, that allowed us back into the presence of God. But there's language here about being clothed with skins, which is a direct reference to Eden, of course. There's the Ark of the Covenant has angels with swords on it, which is only talked about in the Garden of Eden, where the angel with the swords are guarding the gates of Eden. We'll talk about the rest next time. Thoughts on those things?